What I'm about to share with you is a fairly dry recitation of laws and regulations, government policies, and discussions of geopolitics. But underneath it, I want all of the members of the audience to understand we're really discussing a situation that is involving life and death issues for millions and millions of Ukrainians, and also Russians through their forces that are being compelled to fight this war of choice in Ukraine. So as we dive into these areas, I hope we all keep that human perspective in place. Last, I'm going to have to embellish my comments that had been prepared for today's comments because events in this field break very, very quickly. And so some developments happened last night, even though I sent my slide deck to Anna relatively late last night. Even as I was going to bed, I checked the news feeds on my phone and found 2 more developments that had happened that affect the content of my remarks. So we'll try to get through some of those updates in the course of my remarks. First of all, these are the pillars upon which US economic sanctions and export controls rest. There are certain general statutes that have been passed by Congress, and those in particular involve 3 laws: the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, known in the trade as the IEEPA, Trading with the Enemy Act, TWIA, and the National Emergencies Act. Almost all presidents over the last 30 years have relied on these statutes to engage with the rest of the world in these urgent situations. In addition, Congress has passed very specialized legislation in addition to these general enabling statutes. Chief among these involving Russia and the Ukraine is the Protecting Europe's Energy Security Act of 2019, known as PISA, and I'll talk about PISA and how it affects these things in a moment. Last, but certainly not least, there are international agreements that the United States is party to, including various actions taken by the UN Security Council and that are taken in regard to treaties that the United States is party to. There are 3 agencies that my colleagues and I in our law firm work with regularly. First, US State Department, and I would mention in that regard that we are honored to have in our audience here today Assistant Secretary Richard Stilwell, former Assistant Secretary for East Asian Affairs in the Trump administration, sitting here in the front row. But he would certainly validate that the State Department has a very pivotal role in assessing the need for these kinds of economic sanctions and export controls. On the implementation side, once you get beyond those policy decisions, US Treasury Department and its Office of Foreign Assets Control is the primary vehicle for implementation of economic sanctions. And the US Commerce Department's Bureau of Industry and Security, or BIS, is very central to the implementation of export controls. So when we talk about sanctions, we have 2 typical scenarios to play with. First are primary sanctions. Primary sanctions are those that the United States law can reach directly and affect. Generally speaking, those sanctions then apply to American persons, or what we call in this regard, US persons. Those are persons who are US citizens, US permanent resident aliens, organizations that are formed under US law, and foreign persons who happen to be within the territory of the United States at the relevant time. So primary sanctions take effect directly because the US government has legal jurisdiction over them. They can send out an FBI agent or a US Marshal to arrest that person on US soil. And so many of our counseling sessions as private practice lawyers is to counsel US persons, that is US companies, US individuals, US universities, US foundations, and others who may be affected by these sanctions that are announced by the United States. There is a grayer area of jurisdiction when US organizations such as corporations have foreign subsidiaries. And so then you begin to gradually move into a gray zone of legal jurisdiction over how much authority US organizations have over those foreign enterprises. Take, for example, Corporation XYZ has a subsidiary in France. It's staffed entirely by French nationals. They sell only French-made goods. Is it fair? Is it reasonable? Is it consistent with international law for that French subsidiary to be required to obey US law when it's doing business in France with all French personnel, all French goods? And so those kinds of territorial issues come up in the scope of international law discussions. Then in addition, there are also secondary sanctions which affect organizations outside the reach of US law. And so those operate primarily because of the ability to deny market access. So when the United States government speaks of secondary sanctions, they don't mean that the marshal or the FBI agent can go out and arrest the person. Rather, what they say is that organization may not make use of American resources. For instance, they may not obtain loans from US banks. They may not list their shares on a US stock exchange. They may not sell their goods to the US government, and so on. So those are secondary sanctions. One of the most powerful secondary sanctions, which we'll pick up in the course of this talk today, has to do with access to US dollar resources. US dollars constitute the largest foreign exchange used in international trade. Almost all US dollar clearances moved around the world, moved through a clearinghouse in New York City called CHIPS. And so as a consequence of being able to control CHIPS, which is a US person and directly subject to US law, it can regulate the ability of people to move US dollar accounts because CHIPS serves as the vehicle by which US dollars flow around the world. Probably 95% of all US dollar transactions of any significance in the world move through the CHIPS clearinghouse in New York City. So the United States has a very firm grip on that clearinghouse, and as a consequence, can impose a very, very stiff sanction on international business transactions, even if entirely between companies or banks in other countries, if the transaction is denominated in US dollars. Within the primary sanctions, there are also two types. There are list-based sanctions, and there are country-based or territorial sanctions. And we'll see examples of both of these as we walk through this discussion today. So let's refocus then on Ukraine. For many of us, we had not paid much attention to the existence of Ukraine at all, but for this invasion. And so it's well to remember that Ukraine is one of the largest nations in Europe. It has 44 million people. It exists because of an independence that was achieved in the 1990s when the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics dissolved and each of the different republics went off in their own direction. And so it's a relatively newer independent country. I've listed on this slide a number of the economic aspects of Ukraine, many of which will be important as I highlight in regard particularly to its role in energy and its role in the world food supply, both in terms of its grain production and in terms of its production of sunflower oil and other oil products that are vastly important to many parts of the Middle East and Africa in particular. This is a map that I've borrowed from BBC that shows how NATO grew after the dissolution of the USSR in early 1990s. And as of 1997, you can see that yellow band in the middle with all the different numbered countries there that have joined NATO since the 1990s and where they sit geographically relative to Russia and to Ukraine. So it's always important to sort of get a sense of the geographical terrain in which we're going to have our geopolitical discussion. So if we go back historically to the first Russian invasion involving Crimea under the Obama administration, President Obama issued several executive orders in 2014 to deal with that initial incursion. So the current generation of US sanctions on Russia rest on the substrate of these executive orders and regulations that were adopted in 2014 as the first tranche of sanctions. And they were very limited in scope. They were very limited in effect. They primarily keyed off the energy sector and the financial sector, and to a lesser extent, the aerospace and technology sectors of the Russian economy. But they did not try in any way to hurt Russia deeply. The idea was to give a measured response, and that was all they attempted to do in the 2014 period. Now, fast forward to 2021 and 2022, we have considerably more executive orders that have been signed by President Biden. And these have escalated in scope and in depth with each successive executive order issued. I won't try to go through all of these in detail. For those of you who are in the room here today, your kits have in the folder in the right-hand pocket copies of detailed articles that track each of these executive orders and what their effect was on specific sectors. For those of you who are watching online, there will be an online access to all of these materials as PDFs that you can download if you're interested in getting through some of the detailed explanations. So let's try now to drill down into these a little bit more in detail. These sanctions primarily have targeted individual Russian oligarchs. They have and business leaders. They have targeted Russian banks. They have and corporations. There are many of these that have been named to what is called the Specially Designated Nationals List, or the SDN list, which makes it illegal for American persons to deal with them. They have also targeted specific sectors such as the shipping industry, the energy sector, and others. One of the key measures taken was with regard to the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which was intended to bring natural gas from Russia directly to Germany under the Baltic Sea. That pipeline has been completely finished, but because of the invasion of Ukraine, the United States and Germany have discussed this, and Germany has refused to allow the final permits to be issued to activate that pipeline. And so it is, at the moment, a very large and very unuseful paperweight at the bottom of the Baltic Sea, and may remain that way for some time to come. Some of the other sanctions have been directed against the Russian central bank. These are really unprecedented sanctions that have done away with a large amount of the foreign currency reserves and sort of iced them out of reach of the Russian central bank. That's cut about half of their access. In addition, you may hear things about SWIFT. And the SWIFT is an international consortium of banks based in Belgium that provides secure, fast, reliable interbank communications to organize wire transfers around the world. As a consequence, membership in SWIFT is very, very important. This SWIFT, because it's in Belgium and not in the United States, is not a US person, not subject to US sanctions, but is subject to EU sanctions. And so in concert with the United States, the EU has booted quite a number of the large Russian banks off the SWIFT system, making it much more difficult and expensive for them to transact business internationally. And as of last night, one of the recent developments is that Sberbank, the largest banking system in Russia, will be taken off SWIFT by the EU starting, I believe, this week. And these are the same targeted banks that the United States and the UK had also targeted, once again, sort of reinforcing the allied actions that are being taken in this area. I'm going to step back for a moment and leave the world of economic sanctions and talk instead about export controls, which is sort of the other half of my practice experience. Export controls are special laws that require government oversight and permission to move technology from the United States to other countries. They exist because these types of technologies are deemed to have military or strategic content, as well as civilian and commercial value. And so there are things that could be repurposed and reused by those who have malign intent in ways that could be harmful to US security interests. So these regulations exist all the time. They're part of the daily life of advanced technology companies in the United States. And there is a specific system set up within the Commerce Department at the Bureau of Industry and Security to regulate when and how US origin technology can be shared offshore. The core of these export administration regulations, or the EAR, is something called the Commerce Control List. I'm going to take this mask off since I'm at the podium. It'll make it perhaps a little more audible for you. So there are hundreds and hundreds of entries on the Commerce Control List that define what kinds of technologies are subject to these controls. The United States has also negotiated with its allies in an arrangement called the Wassenaar Arrangement, in which other allied countries, primarily those in Western Europe and Japan, Australia, South Korea, and others, have all agreed to control the same things for the same reasons. They may have different consequences and different licensing mechanisms in each of the individual countries, but generally speaking, under the Wassenaar Arrangement, which involves almost 50 nations, all the countries have agreed at least to control the same articles. The EAR also has a number of specific lists of named companies, individuals, organizations, even universities that are deemed in varying degrees off limits for exports of US technology that's been controlled. And so those lists are a very fundamental part of the regulatory system. And I'll show you how they have been used in the context of these sanctions on Russia. So moving right into that, in late February, the Biden administration expanded the list of entities and articles that are subject to export licensing in order to go to Russia. The idea was to really put a dent in the Russian economy, particularly in the area of advanced technologies, in technologies that would matter to the key sectors that generate revenue for the Russian government. In this case, oil and gas was heavily targeted again. And so as a consequence, these measures impose license requirements on goods that previously were not required to be licensed. In addition, the Bureau has announced it will apply a presumption of denial, meaning that all other things being equal, the administration's approach to an application for supplying these goods to Russia will be to turn down the application immediately. And so this is a very blunt instrument, but it's a very heavy instrument to apply against the Russian economy. We've talked already about the Russian Central Bank. This was taken in conjunction with the activities of the other G7 member nations. And so this cuts off access of the Russian Ministry of Finance and the Russian Central Bank to many of the large hard currency assets that they have that were being counted on to be able to sustain the Russian economy, even in the face of sanctions. And so this is an unprecedented move. There's never been a move of this kind before. In furtherance of these sanctions, the Biden administration also took note of the fact that Russia wanted to become part of the World Trade Organization and underwent a 19-year membership application process that culminated in August of 2012 when it was admitted to the WTO. Under the WTO procedures, every other member nation is required to give what is called most favored nation or MFN treatment on tariffs to the goods of other countries that are also members of the WTO. But on March 11, President Biden announced that he would support legislation to revoke the MFN status for Russia. Congress very quickly passed legislation. The House passed it 420 to 3. The Senate passed it unanimously. And obviously, in a time of great division in Washington, D.C., votes that are that lopsided show a very strong bipartisan consensus here. And so President Biden signed that measure into law on April 7th immediately. And so as of April 9, almost all Russian goods now face much higher tariffs. It's not as if Russia is a large trading partner of the United States. In fact, in terms of purchasing inbound goods, Russia is number 40 on the US trading list, so it's pretty far down. But the symbolism is important for the United States here. Okay. Why is this not advancing? I am not able to advance the slides any further.
Okay, working again.
Thank you. Sorry. I'm a lawyer, not a technologist. So energy exports constitute a very, very large segment of the Russian economy. And surprisingly so when you think of it as a great power in the world. In 2019, approximately 40% of all Russian government revenue were due to sales of crude oil and other petroleum products and natural gas. In fact, it constituted about 60% of all their exports that year. So their primary outlet for these energy products has been Europe. The statistics have been publicized very highly over the last several months that they provide about 1/4 of the EU's crude oil, about 40% of its natural gas, and about 70% of its coal. So it's a big deal for the Russian government to be able to sell these energy products into Europe and into other world markets. Since the war began, there's been a great deal of concern about how to leverage this revenue stream as an additional provider or avenue for economic sanctions. So first, the United States has barred the importation of Russian energy products. We did not get a great deal from Russia ourselves, but we've also been trying to persuade the EU to apply these sanctions. It's much harder for the EU to reach these decisions. But last night, the EU announced that it will seek to end all crude oil imports largely by the end of 2022, reaching roughly a 90% reduction in crude oil imports. It's much harder on the natural gas side because it's much harder to replace natural gas than it is crude oil. And so there's going to be a continued tension within the EU between those that are highly dependent on these Russian energy imports for countries such as Germany and Hungary in particular, versus those that are less dependent. So we'll have to see how that plays out. But obviously, this is a huge lever. The United States, for its part, is trying its best to serve the European energy needs by replacing some of that through, for instance, LNG shipments from the United States. The aviation sector is not to be neglected. And so in the last several months, the United States has placed great pressure on the aviation sector and on the airlines and air transport mechanisms within Russia. They have cut off all licenses for parts and components and the export of additional aircraft. Both Airbus and Boeing, who are major providers of civilian transport aircraft to Russian airlines, have pretty much pulled out of Russia. And many of the lessors of commercial aviation aircraft have tried to end their leases. Aeroflot in particular has grounded its entire fleet of aircraft to avoid having their leased aircraft repossessed by the lessors if they're outside Russian space. And so the thought is they will only be able to fly domestically. Many of those will no longer be certified and serviced by Western service providers. So gradually over time, we see there will be a gradual degradation of the Russian air fleet and inability to move people around the country safely. Again, another sector that's targeted is the maritime sector. And so those have really been targeted. Russian vessels may no longer call on US ports. And many of the heavy transport freighters and tankers have now facing difficulties in getting marine insurance. So that makes it very difficult for them to operate internationally. There are indications based on satellite observations and monitoring of Russian shipping that many of them are now attempting to do relatively dangerous and expensive and time-consuming transfers from ship to ship at sea in order to avoid having their ships exposed to these sanctions, which is again another sign of how deeply these sanctions are cutting. More and more names continue to be added to the SDN list as the sanctions spread and touch more banks, more companies, more individuals. These are the things you read about in the newspapers and watch on cable news as Russian oligarchs' yachts and planes and other things are being seized. This is all part of that outreach of effort that way. One of the key elements of the Biden administration sanctions was on the ability to process US dollar payments. The Russian economy, like most other economies in the world, relies on sovereign debt for part of its financing of government operations. So they sell bonds on the world bond markets. Bonds are traditionally denominated in dollars for repayment. So a very large tranche of Russian sovereign debt requires that repayment of interest and servicing fees be made in US dollars. As I said earlier today, all US dollar payments have to go through the CHIPS system and through US banks for the most part, in addition. And so in late February, sanctions were announced that would preclude US banks from processing US dollar payments for the Russian central bank and for other Russian financial institutions. In this month of May, the Biden administration indicated that those sanctions will now go into full effect, except for 2 Russian banks who will be allowed to continue processing payments through US banks into June. But for the most part, what this means is, as of the 25th of May, US banks such as JP Morgan Chase and Citigroup can no longer process dollar payments. And so this means that these bondholders that are expecting to be paid in US dollars will no longer get payment. And this will lead to defaults. These, if they do happen, will be the first time the Russian government has defaulted on its sovereign debt since the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. So this is really going to be a stunning historical occasion if and when that happens, likely in late July, when the grace period for these bonds will run out. There are more export controls. As I mentioned earlier, most of the export control machinery is geared toward control of strategic goods that have both civilian and military applications. Those are all listed on the Commerce Control List. However, in this latest wave of sanctions aimed through the export control mechanism, the government is reaching out and imposing license requirements on non-military, non-strategic goods that are industrially important goods. We've never done that before. in US export control history. And so, except very briefly in the 2014 sanctions imposed by the Obama administration, but almost 500 different kinds of industrial goods that are real valuable inputs to Russian industry have now been put on this special list of sanctions, and they will require licenses as well to be sold, and the US government will apply the same presumption of denial to those applications. I'm showing on this slide one paragraph out of a very long joint statement, which I commend to everybody in this audience. You can find it on the internet. But on February 4, while President Putin was in China attending the Olympic Games, the Chinese government and the Russian government released a joint statement. And this has been much noted by observers of the geopolitics in the region. And I've underlined the sentence in there that stresses that the friendship between Russia and China has no limits. And many people have taken that as a very significant statement, a kind of alliance, if you will, being declared between Russia and China, even in the face of the Russian invasion. The United States in the Indo-Pacific has clearly faced the reality that China and India could each either join or defeat the sanctions measures that have gone in. In particular, China and Russia each have very deep defense industries and have the ability to supply more weapons to the Russians, more ammunition, more equipment, more supplies. Both countries have bought in the past and could buy more in the future energy exports that are being displaced from Europe and elsewhere. Both could provide alternative back channels for the movement of financial transactions through systems denominated in rupees or renminbi that would get around the dollar and pound and euro sanctions that have been leveled by the West. And so right now, the world is watching to see what China and India will do. For the most part, they have offered certainly verbal support to the Russians. They have refrained from criticizing Russia's invasion in so many words. They have generally voted either to abstain or against sanctions measures at the United Nations, but they have not broken overtly with the US sanctions, although Chinese media continue to feed the same misinformation and disinformation that are being pumped out by the Russian Ministry of Information. It's interesting then to look at the May 26th speech just a couple of days ago by Secretary of State Tony Blinken. And I've quoted here some very strong language that observes the linkage between China and Russia in regard to the invasion of Ukraine and the violation of the sovereign territory of Ukraine. And I think the United States is being quite clear-eyed and realistic about this situation and urging China and India both to observe these sanctions and not to try to defeat them. It is interesting to see how the war in Ukraine and China's apparent alignment in support of Russia is playing out in public opinion. The Pew Research Center ran a survey in March after the war began. And if you look at these numbers, these are some of the worst figures ever in polling history about US attitude toward China and how many people now see China as a rival, as a competitor, even using the word enemy as a result. And I've italicized in the last line of this slide how many people are really alarmed about the alignment of China and Russia as something that the United States has to take very, very seriously in the future. So what are we seeing as fallout from the invasion? Obviously, there's this tragic human cost. Refugees, nearly 6 million displaced Ukrainians now have fled into other nations across Western Europe. We've dislocated the energy markets around the world. And you can see it in every time you go to the gas station, you look at how much we're paying per gallon for driving these days. It's fueled a new renaissance within NATO, even causing neutral Finland and Sweden to suddenly break from their past policies of neutrality. And assuming Turkey does not exercise its veto, Finland and Sweden will probably soon join NATO. It has certainly affected world food supplies, both directly because Ukraine is such a large provider of corn and wheat and other grains, but also because Ukraine and Russia together constitute the largest supplies of fertilizer inputs, particularly for things like potash and others that are required for the preparation and manufacture of fertilizer, even in the United States. So our food supply is affected by this war because of that linkage. And so as a consequence, the whole world is affected by this war and by the sanctions imposed by the West. And so it's not as if this is a unilateral cost. Every time these sanctions are imposed, there are costs on ourselves, in our economy, and on our people, and also on the West. Obviously, quite a number of companies have chosen, because of the situation, to pull out of Russia. And so the Russian economy is suffering from the loss of many hundreds of thousands of jobs that these companies offer to Russian people, and they can see it dramatically in their own economy. So this is my final slide, my crystal ball. We are using economic sanctions in the West because it is the last best instrument that we have, short of actual conflict and confrontation between NATO forces and Russian forces. We don't want to get in a fighting war with the Russians, particularly because of the fact that then we have nuclear armed powers in direct conflict. We're doing everything possible to avoid that and using everything possible short of war to confront Russia and to urge them to find a peaceful resolution to this terrible war of choice. There will be more sanctions, and the latest came last night, as I said before. Congress may get into the action as well and impose even deeper sanctions if that's possible. If more parts of Ukraine fall under Russian control, then they will become sanctioned the way the Crimea, Luhansk, and Donetsk regions have been. And the last point, coming back to this talk at the East-West Center, is that the effectiveness of these economic tools can be blunted, quite frankly, if other large nations, particularly here in the Indo-Pacific, who have the wealth, who have the technology, who have the financial and economic power to continue trading with Russia, choose to do that and weaken the sanctions and therefore indirectly prolong the war. And so that's my somewhat grim, news to share with you today. I appreciate the time that the East-West Center has given me to provide this talk. And I'll be glad to take some questions.
Great. So we can take the first question from our in-person audience. Do we have any takers?
Nelson, it's great to see you again. And your education on CFIUS and FIRMA carried me a lot during my time at the state. But this is related to that. We're focusing on economic sanctions here. Are there other sanctions that we can apply in conjunction with outside of the economic space, or maybe others inside the economic space that would either be able to focus the effect to get the outcome we want, or broaden the effect to get the Russians to take this seriously?
Well, I think there are wiser heads in mind in the government who are constantly pondering whether there are more ways to push. Obviously, we have other symbolic sanctions that I didn't talk about that are like visa denials and those sorts of things, which you knew well from your time at the State Department. But generally speaking, I think they've taken pretty much all the low-hanging fruit at this point. The logical places, particularly for the Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control, which is historically always focused on economic, financial sector pressure. So they've gone against the banks. the Russian economy is in some ways unique in the size in which the energy sector and natural resources sectors prevail. They don't, if you think about it, there are virtually no Russian brand name goods, for instance. It's not as if they have a huge commercial sector, so there are only so many ways you can reach into the Russian economy. And they've gone after the big ticket items, if you will, which is the financial sector, the oil and gas sector, the transport sector, both maritime and aviation. So I think they're trying their best to exert pressure that counts because there are limited resources and limited political capital that have to go into building consensus with our allies for these measures. And so anything else becomes probably less productive, less return on investment for the effort invested.
Great. So now we have a question from our online audience. Hopefully this isn't too far out of your scope. Should we be worried about Putin and a nuclear war? The audience or the member wrote, I don't like being bullied by him with that as a threat, and I think it is empty. What are your thoughts, Nelson?
Well, as I hate to say this, but I think that one is well above my pay grade. General Stilwell here might have an answer for that kind of question. I do think that, the conventional wisdom is that unlike Western nations that have nuclear weapons, where by and large, our military in the West do not believe in a first strike, the Russian military have trained and developed doctrine which posits at least the use of tactical nuclear weapons in certain contingent situations as part of their normal doctrine of war. And that's different. So we can hear the Russians speak to that, but I think the cost of starting that would be so irreparable to them and to the world that I think they would be very slow to do that and to use that. But that's just one layperson's guess, and there are certainly going to be other people better qualified to provide an answer to that question.
Do we have other in-person questions?
Thank you very much for your talk. You mentioned the potential limited impact of economic sanctions depending on the countries in the Indo-Pacific's participation or whatnot in them. I'm just wondering if we look at it in a different way. Do you think that the potential success of these sanctions is going to lead to a renaissance in their use in other matters for other countries as well? Are we going to see them being used more often now for other matters as a result of this experience? Thank you.
So in case that wasn't heard, the question from the audience here in the room was whether the use of sanctions in regard to Russia could lead to a renaissance of the use of such sanctions in other circumstances. I think this is a fairly unprecedented war, in the 21st century, the first major land war since the end of World War II on European soil. And so I think that has galvanized Western Europe in an unusual way. And the sort of the rightness and wrongness is so clear to so many other nations in the world because it goes against the UN Charter and the notion of sovereignty and peaceful coexistence one with another. That the United States has found, generally speaking, a much easier time forging a consensus to oppose this war and to use these sanctions very, very broadly and very deeply. Ordinarily, the kind of alignment that you're seeing in these sanctions today is very hard to achieve, and it takes months and months, sometimes years of negotiating between countries to achieve this kind of outcome. And here, the sanctions have been imposed in some cases in a matter of weeks, which is really like light speed in this world of policy. So I do not see this as necessarily opening the door to this kind of activity, broadly. And I hope there will not be other occasions to use it broadly, because the world does not need another war like this one.
Thank you. So from online, the sanctions on Russian oligarchs seem based on the assumption that Putin rules only when with the consent of the oligarchs. Is that assumption valid? Putin seems to be able to take down individual oligarchs who get on his bad side. Would targeting some other group be more effective in indirectly pressuring Putin?
I am a sanctions lawyer. I'm not a Russia area specialist, and I wouldn't be qualified to express a great deal of opinion on that question. I just don't feel qualified to answer it.
Fair enough. How about we'll try another one from online. Why do you think Ukraine has not shut down the, the Druzhba pipeline in Hungary?
Well, I think the reason that has not been shut down is that, Hungary has absorbed quite a number of the refugees fleeing from Ukraine. The question for those in the audience who don't understand, there is a direct Russian pipeline for Russian natural gas and or rather crude oil being pumped into Hungary through this particular pipeline. And the Hungarian government has been very insistent that its agreement to these broad sanctions on crude oil imports into the EU will only be taken against seaborne crude oil. That is, crude oil coming by tanker. And so in the current generation of sanctions that were agreed to yesterday, the EU is only going to apply sanctions to tanker-borne crude oil, but not to oil coming in by pipeline, which would exempt this particular pipeline because the Hungarian economy is so dependent upon that. So I think the Ukrainians have sort of made a cost-benefit analysis that while they would love to cut off that revenue to the Russian economy, along with the other forms of revenue, that the cost of breaking the EU consensus and alienating the Hungarian government makes it impossible for them to make that choice. I forgot one thing.
With the sanctions the way they stand now, and with the position of India and China, how long, in your opinion, will it take till it might cause Putin to pause and reconsider, if ever?
There are multiple moving parts involved in what we can foresee as his calculus. Part of it is whether in the new strategy that appears to be taking over the Donbass region in eastern Ukraine and being able to claim to break off a part of the Ukraine and assert de facto control as it had done in Crimea. I mean, they had basically annexed Crimea to Russia. He has to be able to show some geopolitical gain to the Russian people at the end of the day before he can leave the field. And so he has to show that he has conquered some significant part of the country and created the same kind of annexation possibility as has occurred in Crimea. So I think his timeline is between the collapse of the Russian economy, if that could be foreseeable, versus the time it will take tactical forces to conquer that much territory in the east and be able to run up a signal and declare victory, at least in that limited way. So then he can consolidate and hold that part. That means dismembering Ukraine, obviously. It means probably a nearly permanent state of hostility between Ukraine and Russia because of that, because Ukraine cannot accept in its own political system loss of that much territory, which includes much of the industrial base in Ukraine. It will really be a very crippled country going forward, and particularly if the Russian forces continue to expand along the lower southern arc westward toward Odessa, a major seaport. If then it takes Ukraine entirely takes away all of Ukraine's seaports, then the rest of Ukraine is essentially landlocked. And they depend on seaport access, for instance, for their agriculture economy, for all those shipments of wheat, corn, rye, and other grains, and oils and things, all have to flow through those ports. That's why there was such a big struggle over Mariupol, recently in this first wave of action. So it's going to be a race between those kinds of factors. When can he declare some sort of victory versus feeling the crunch on the economy so badly?
So just to follow up quickly, does that mean that he declares victory, takes that possession of that area, and that's a stance? The guy says, okay, and things go back to normal.
I don't think anybody really knows what the new normal might look like at this point. There aren't that many historical precedents. I think General Stilwell here could probably talk about what it was like at the DMZ, and at the 38th parallel between North Korea and South Korea. But it will probably be fortified like that and dangerous like that. You can look at what it's been like in the Crimea since 2014, 8 years of experience like that, which is still lobbing shells and artillery fire back and forth and being fairly dangerous and volatile, but unless there's a sufficient military force to eject the Russians once they've taken possession, it's hard to see how the status quo could be restored.
General Stella, did you want to add anything?
Not on that.
Okay, great. All right, so could you please respond to the Russian and Chinese propaganda argument that the United States is profiting from the Ukraine war? Is the USA, for example, charging Europe more for natural gas than Russia charged?
I don't have any firsthand data or experience in how US companies are pricing energy that's being supplied. We do know that world prices are going sky high. I think oil and Brentwood crude is over 115 a barrel at this point. And the United States has no unilateral power to set those prices. They're world prices. And they're largely influenced by organizations outside the United States like OPEC. So I'm sure American energy companies will participate and be profitable as a result of selling those energy supplies, to any companies that want to buy them. But I don't think they're in a position to do any more than any other energy company will that are based in the Middle East or based elsewhere in the world. I think all the energy supplier countries will be profiting from this situation, except hopefully the Russian ones.
This is half a statement and a question. In 2011, 2013, China and Ukraine swore devout fealty, and they swore that they would support each other's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Meaning that in this case, China is in a rock and a hard place deciding whether it was going to actually live up to its word or not. It also said, as you showed in that quote, that there's a no limits agreement with Russia. They opted for Russia in this case. When we see how the PRC works with, let's say, Korea and Japan, they look for seams and divisions, and they try to drive wedges between them. Do you see any opportunities here in the sanctions world or elsewhere to drive, because a bad outcome here is that we have a divided Cold War world with Russia and China on one side, and the rest of the world on the other. Do you see options for wedges to divide those two, make them stare at each other with doubt, question each other's motives, et cetera?
Well, I think, excuse me, I think the economic sanctions that have been imposed by the West generally do create a potential, or at least a pressure on the Chinese, so they cannot make the decision totally unilaterally, because there will be a political and a geopolitical price to be paid. For instance, you can see this perhaps more clearly relative to Europe than the United States, but the US has been in some ways decoupling from China politically and economically for about the last decade or 15 years. And that Pew set of data that I showed you, is some demonstration, some signal of that kind of chilling of the enthusiasm that used to be there between the United States and China. So the Chinese have then pivoted to focus much more both geopolitical and economic attention to Europe. But the war in Ukraine is a positive existential threat to Europe and its peace and stability. So to the extent that China is visibly in the corner of Russia on this war, it complicates their relationships with Europe to a far greater extent and exerts a great deal of pause, I think, on the part of decision makers in Beijing about whether to go forward more overtly in Russia's corner or not. Notwithstanding that statement about no limits, the reality is there are limits, and they understand that. And if they move too quickly, too far, and are too visible in that corner, then it will really damage their relations with Europe. For instance, their free trade agreement negotiations were stalled just because of the war, probably. And so they're already beginning to feel that kind of break on their action. That's how I would respond to that.
Thank you. So we are just at 1 o'clock. So we've got one more online question for you, and then we'll wrap it up. So you may have answered part of this question in your last response, but what are other methods exist to get India and China, or either, to join the financial opposition?
I mean, from where I have sat as a private practice attorney, observing the behavior of large nation states such as China and India, I think they will each continue to make decisions in their own self-interest. And I don't think it's going to be possible for the United States to persuade them to join in the sanctions regimes. I just don't think that's realistic. I think all that the West can hope is that they will not do anything overtly to break the sanctions, to resist them, to enable the Russians to avoid the sanctions wholesale. And so that's why I said, in the 3 bullets on one of my slides, both the Chinese and Indians could choose to supply munitions to the Russian forces to replace their catastrophic losses. If they choose to do that, and suddenly we see either Indian or Chinese equipment in the field, that would be a visible signal to the United States and also to Europe that they have really taken sides. So if they can continue to withhold that kind of support to the Russians and not fuel the war, that's probably as much as we can hope for, from the West. That would be my take.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Nelson, for your time and expertise today. I know that you have broken down a lot of complex economic sanctions and export control measures for us. And it's, as you mentioned, late breaking. And so thank you so much for getting us this really timely information. Really appreciate it.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you.
And thank you to our in-person audience and to our audience on Zoom. We have another talk tomorrow featuring Austrian Consul General Dr. Michael Postel. He'll also be talking about the Russia and Ukraine conflict, but offering Austrian and European perspectives. So if you're able to, please join us. We'll have information on that event on our website, eastwestcenter.org/events. With that, I hope you all have a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you.